Hey, welcome to Draft Academy. My name is Mike. In this tutorial, I want to talk to you about event listeners in JavaScript. An event listener is basically something in JavaScript where you can run a specific function or a specific block of code when a user does something. So, for example, if a user clicked on a button, I could then call a function and do something. Or if a user hovered over an image or something, we could perform a specific function. Or if the user scrolled down or pressed a specific key on the keyboard, we could do something. Basically, event listeners allow you to monitor certain HTML elements or certain elements of the HTML page. And then when the user interacts with them, you can perform certain functions. So I'm going to show you guys how to do that. The first thing we're going to do is have something happen when I click this button. So I have this big button over here, and when I click it, nothing happens. Not really a good button, right? Over here in my HTML file, you can see down here we have just this button. It has like an ID. It says click me. I'm going to show you guys how you can execute a JavaScript function when this button gets clicked. So there's actually a certain HTML attribute that we can give to this. And I can say on click, and I can say equals and then quotation marks. And this is what's called a JavaScript event. So on click is a JavaScript event, and when the user clicks on this button, the JavaScript code that's inside of these quotation marks is going to get executed. So if I wanted, I could put some JavaScript code in here, and I'll just say alert you, whoops, these need to be single, you clicked me, right? So I'm saying on click, I want to execute the following JavaScript code, alert you clicked me out onto the screen. So now when I refresh the page and I click the button, you'll see that we get this alert. It says you clicked me, right? And that's kind of cool. And so whatever code I put inside of these quotation marks is going to get executed when I click that button. Although here's the problem, is like putting, a bunch of JavaScript code inside of these quotation marks is kind of a drag. And if you're writing a lot of JavaScript, you're not going to want to put it inside of there. So what we can actually do is call a function from inside of this on click, and then we can execute that function in like an external JavaScript file. So I could write a function here. I could say handle click. And now whenever this button gets clicked, it's going to execute a JavaScript function called handle click. So I'm going to go over to my script.js file, and this is my external JavaScript file that's linked up with that HTML file. And I'm going to create a function called handle click. And inside of this function now, any code that I put in here is going to get executed when I click the button. So I can write out an alert that says clicked, and now when I refresh the page, I click the button, this function gets run. So that's the basics of handling like a click event, for example. When that button gets clicked now, this function is going to get run. And I could also put this same thing on the image. So if I wanted, I could copy this on click line right here, and I'm just going to paste it over here on this image. So now when we click the image, that handle click function is also going to get called. So if I click the button, we get the alert. If I click the image, we also get the alert. So these events can be used on any HTML element. It doesn't really matter what it is. But here's another question is, let's say I wanted to, when I click this button, I wanted to change the text on the actual button. Well, I'm going to have to be able to access that button. And what you can do is you can pass a parameter inside of this handle click function, and you can actually pass the current element that's calling it. So in here, I can just say this. And when I use this keyword, what this is going to represent is the current element that's calling this, or the current element that's getting clicked. So this is actually going to represent this button. So when I go over here into my JavaScript file now, I can just add in a parameter up here. We'll just say element. And now I'll be able to access the element that got clicked. So we can get rid of this alert, and I'm going to say element.innerHTML. So I'm going to modify the inner HTML in this button, and I'll just set it equal to clicked. So now when I come over here and I click this button, you'll see that the text changes from click me to clicked. So every time I click this, the text is going to change. And so really I could do anything I want. If I clicked this, I could, instead of setting the inner HTML, I could set the style, and we could like change the background color to blue. So now when I click the button, the background color is going to get changed to blue. And so that's kind of the basics of using an on-click with an HTML element, and then you can see how we can pass in the current element that's doing the clicking into this function, and then we can access it and modify it. So that's one way that we can use these event listeners. There's another way that we can do it though, and we can do it entirely from the JavaScript. So when we did this, we had to put this on-click attribute on this actual HTML element. But there's a way to, for example, monitor for a click or monitor for a different event without having to use the attribute inside the HTML. And I'm going to show you guys how we can do that with this image. So what I want to do is whenever I hover over the image, I want to make the image a little bit bigger, and I want to give it like a background shadow so it looks like we're hovering over it. So I'm going to come over here into my JavaScript file, and I'm actually going to create a variable, and I'm going to make a variable for that image element. So I'm basically going to grab that image element off the page. So I'll say var, and we'll just call this image is equal to document.getElement by ID. And the ID of that image, I believe, is just image. So actually, let's double check that. So yeah, the ID is just image right there. So this image variable is actually storing that image over here, this picture of the Draft Academy logo. So I can say image.add event listener. And what this is going to do is it's basically going to add an event listener onto this HTML element. So remember, we had to physically add that on-click event listener onto that button element, but this is going to do it for us using JavaScript. And so I want to pass this two parameters, and the first is going to be the event that we want to watch out for. So in our case, we want to call this event listener when the mouse hovers over the image. So there's an event called mouse over. And basically what this will do is it'll execute some code when the mouse goes over the HTML element. And the second parameter we can pass is the actual code that we want to execute. So what we can do is we can put a function inside of here, and you want to pass this a function. And you'll notice here I'm creating a function. I'm just saying function, open and closed parentheses, open and close curly brackets, and I'm just going to click enter. And now any of the code that we want to execute when the mouse goes over this image, we're just going to put in here inside of this function that we passed in as a parameter. So any code that I put in here is going to get executed when my mouse goes over that image. In our case, we're going to want to, like I said, modify some of the styling about that image. Now, if I want to access that image HTML element, all I have to do is say this, and this is automatically going to represent the element that just got moused over. So I can say this dot style, and I want to set the style equal to, we'll give it a box shadow, and it's just going to be like 2 pixels, 2 pixels, 2 pixels, and we'll make it gray. So I'm going to give this some styling, and then I also want to modify the size of the image. So I'm going to say this dot width, and we'll set this equal to 150 pixels, or just 150. So now when I mouse over this image, you'll notice that this event handler is going to get called. And so the image is going to get a little bit bigger, and you'll see that there's this shadow under here. So actually this is a little too big. Let's just set it equal to 110. So now when I mouse over the image, you'll see it gets a little bigger. We get that box shadow. But here's the problem is when I mouse over the image, it gets big, but then when I mouse out of the image, nothing happens, right? It just stays the same. So what I want to happen is when my mouse enters this image, I want it to get bigger, and when my mouse exits the image, I want it to get smaller. So we can actually just create another event listener. So I'm gonna copy this guy right here. I'm gonna paste it. But now instead of waiting for the mouse over event, I'm gonna wait for the mouse out event. And this will be called when the mouse leaves the HTML element. And so in that case, we can just set the style back to nothing. We'll get rid of that box shadow, and we'll set the width back to 100, which is what it was initially. So now this should actually work. So when I hover over the image, it gets bigger, and when I hover out of it, it gets smaller. And so you can see how this basically makes the image like responsive to my mouse. And that's kind of a common thing that you'll see in a lot of like websites, is when you mouse over an image, it gets a little bit bigger. So that's the basics of using JavaScript event listeners. Again, one method to do this is to put the event listener directly on the element, like we did with this onClick. So you can literally just add the attribute onto the element. The other method would be to do it through JavaScript. So we can access the element we want, and we can add an event listener, and then we need to put the name of the event listener. And we also need to include a function that's going to get executed when that event is called. In other words, when the user mouses over or mouses out. I want to point out one more thing, which is the name of these events. Now, there are, dozens and dozens of these different events in JavaScript. So I'm over here on this website. It's called HTML DOM events, and it's a W3 Schools site. And it's just w3schools.com/JSRef/DOM_OBJ_event. So this is a great page because it lists out all of the events that you can watch for. So you can see here's like onClick, and we have on mouse over down here, on mouse out. Those are the ones that we use. But there's so many more of these events. Like here's some keyboard events. Here's some frame object events, clipboard events. So if somebody copies or cuts or pastes, media events, if somebody like plays a video or does something with media. I mean, there's all sorts of events that you can see. There's just like this huge list. So what you want to do is head over to this page or a similar page and check out all these different events that you can use. I mean, there's so many, and you can play around with like changing different things on your website when certain things happen. I mean, this is like kind of like the core of JavaScript, which is like you're able to monitor what's happening on the page and what the user is doing. And based off of what the user does, you're able to do other things. In other words, you're able to respond to the user. And that's what's really cool about JavaScript. And that's why these events are so awesome. And I want to point one more thing out. And this is just kind of a small thing, but it's gonna come in handy. So you'll notice over here on this mouse over and this mouse out event, it says on mouse over and on mouse out. But when I use this event inside of my JavaScript over here, you'll see that instead of putting on mouse out like this, I just put mouse out. And when you're using these events and you're using this add event listener, you don't need to put the on with the event. So in fact, you don't want to put it at all. So if I put on mouse out, this wouldn't work. You just want to put mouse out. You want to drop the on, and that's for all of them. But when you're over here in your HTML file and you're adding this as an attribute, you always want to include the on. So if I was to do like a mouse out event, I could say on mouse out. And so I'm going to need the on when I'm doing this on the actual HTML file. But if I'm using the add event listener function, you don't need that on. So that's just like a little tip. And really, like, I would really encourage you guys to head over to this page or a page like this and play around with these different events. Because like I said, this is really where JavaScript becomes responsive, when you can respond to the user. Hey, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like and subscribe to Draft Academy to be the first to know when we release new content. Also, we're always looking to improve, so if you have any constructive criticism or questions or anything, leave a comment below. Finally, if you're enjoying Draft Academy and you want to help us grow, head over to draftacademy.com/contribute and invest in our future.